Number 1.
I love shopping. It's easily my favorite thing to do, especially when seasons change and all the new clothes appear, hanging neatly on gleaming silver racks. Last weekend, I decided to pay my favorite mall a visit. I was looking for a nice pair of spring flats to wear with my jean overalls. I got the flats, and a little something extra I definitely did not pay for. Really, it was my own fault. I got so wrapped up in finding the perfect shoe that I tripped over his foot, nearly sending a carefully placed display of sunglasses to the floor, along with my own clumsy self. I apologized instantly, embarrassed and flustered, but he didn't seem upset. Actually, he looked quite amused. I assumed it was because my face took on a becoming shade of hot red, but maybe it was my panic at the thought that I might have hurt his ankle in all the commotion. Now, I kind of wish I had. After getting up and trying fruitlessly to regain my dignity, I took a good look at the man I accidentally assaulted. He looked at least 30, tall, dark-haired, lanky, and a bit hunched over. I guessed he must have worked at a desk all day. The features that really caught my attention, though, were his teeth, pearly white and straight, like in a toothpaste commercial. He must have noticed me looking, because after that he smiled too much. I excused myself and backed away from him, apologizing one last time for not paying attention to my surroundings, and then left the store. There were plenty more shoe stores in the mall I could shop in, if only to get the sour taste of that humiliating encounter out of my mouth. I ended up going to 3 more stores before finding the right shoes. As I was standing at the till, ready to purchase the newest addition to my footwear collection, the woman working the register smiled adoringly at me, and then at something behind me. I turned my head and saw the man with the teeth staring unblinkingly at me, a wide, bright white grin plastered on his face. I flinched and asked the woman how long he'd been standing there. She said she'd seen him watching me since I entered the store, and assumed he was just in my boat waiting for me. I wondered if he'd followed me to the other stores too, but I hadn't been paying attention. I bought the shoes and slowly made my way out of the store, feeling him watching me through the glass. As soon as I stepped out of the shop, he started towards me. I quickly weaved through a group of people and hurried towards the door as it came through, praying he wouldn't catch me before I made it to my car. Groping through my purse to find my keys, I cursed myself for not having them on hand, just as I pushed through the doors and was momentarily blinded by the sun. Conveniently, I managed to squeeze my tiny car into a parking space right close to the doors, and I practically jumped for joy when my hand finally closed around the sharp metal of my key. I saw the flash of the mall door open just as I unlocked the door and squished myself into my seat. The man stalled as he walked into the sunlight, probably also stunned by the brightness of the day. He squinted and smiled when he saw me pull out of the parking lot. I'd have to drive by him to get out. I sped up and triple-checked that my doors were locked before preparing to pass this terrifying stranger. As my car came about an arm's length away, the man smiled his deranged smile, stuck one of his hands into his mouth, and pulled out a full set of dentures. He then shrieked and threw them at my car. I haven't returned to that mall since, and I don't plan to.
Number 2.
A quick background story. Seattle was initially crippled with traffic due to a semi that overturned in downtown Seattle, which closed I-5 in both directions. To make traffic matters go from worse to unbearable, it had been snowing for most of the day, but snow is something we get every few years or so, which doesn't always go well with the locals. It all started with a massive line of people queuing for the buses to Seattle at 4 p.m., which usually isn't that bad. But it's Seattle. It's a city that freaks out the minute snowflakes start piling up on the streets, but admittedly, the sidewalks and streets are full of slush that could be packed down to ice. Several buses came by loaded up with people filled to the brim. Naturally, people were growing impatient and jumped lines to get on the buses. Finally, I wrangled my way onto the bus after 30 minutes of waiting, only to be stuck in traffic and only move 1 mile in 40 minutes. In the meantime, I decided to read a book to pass the time, but as time went on, I realized that the gentleman next to me became increasingly impatient. There were several moments of direct blank stares near my face while sitting restlessly, and he had been talking to seemingly invisible people. This man was one of the most interesting characters I'd ever come across. And he dressed the part, too. You can tell he's been through a lot and looks worn down. Donning worn-down leather hipster shoes, complete with stained underwear for his socks. He wore seemingly new jeans, as if he just walked out of Goodwill. His evergreen 90s sweater was worn backwards, with a white lady's wool toboggan that had a tag sticking out. Then it struck me. He had been trying to talk to me, and increasingly became more angry. I gestured that I was deaf, but he was clearly mentally unstable that he didn't seem to understand. He continued to drop his things, and it seemed that his plastic bag already had a large hole that it couldn't contain his things. Gloves, food, and a handful of travel toiletries with a collection of other really old miscellaneous items. It looked like it had been sitting in a trash can for a while. It looked like he had been carrying all the stuff by hand. Out of nowhere, he pulls out a canister of Febreze air freshener that looks brand new, and bangs it against the poles of the bus trying to drum. Seriously, I thought that thing was going to violently explode given the way he was banging that pole with nearly full force. The bang shook the whole bus, and there I was, sitting right next to him. In between his drumming breaks, he would offer his Febreze canister to random people. After a rough drumming session, he finally dropped the can, and it disappeared into the void under my seat. After my "I'm deaf" gesture, I didn't want to make any rash movements to cause an incident, so to defuse the situation, I decided to stand up to give him more physical space, so he can breathe a bit more. Perhaps he's claustrophobic, I thought to myself, but it's not my place to assume and judge. I was only hoping to make it a safer situation for everyone, because you will never know what will happen if you provoke someone who can't think clearly. My colleagues, who were riding the bus with me, weren't as empathetic. They returned blank stares, whispered to each other, and smiled while staring back at this gentleman, which made the ride a lot more stressful. Out of the blue, this man screamed at people while we were crossing the 520 bridge, and often berated me behind my back at the top of his lungs. Pointing fingers at people, he continued to drop F-bombs and yell at his passed-out female homeless friend who occupied the seat in front of us. There was a moment when I thought he'd finally calm down, but I was wrong. He opens a brand new hand sanitizer, takes a few sips, and swallowed. Then he followed that up with a swig of Listerine, and then continued to scream at people. The more it went on, the more I was worried for everyone's safety. He continued to make eye contact with a particular gentleman, and exhibited threatening behavior. But thankfully, the bus finally arrived at my next bus stop. After getting off, I could help myself, but feel relieved. But then I got to thinking. We truly live in a very diverse world, and I'm thankful for this experience, even though it could have ended badly. I think this man had some severe form of schizophrenia, from which, I understand, is common among Seattle's homeless population. In fact, Google tells me that approximately 200,000 individuals with schizophrenia or manic depressive illness are homeless, constituting 1/3 of the approximately 600,000 homeless population. This fact alone makes me wish we as a society could put our differences aside and accept responsibility to provide for all kinds of people. Instead of wishing for such a lofty goal, let's do what we can do. We can kill people with a combination of love, respect, and kindness, no matter what kind of struggle they may be dealing with in their lives.
Number 3.
I've been binge reading a lot of stories in this subreddit, and I thought I'd finally submit one of my own creepy encounters. This was one of the most terrifying things that ever happened to me, just because of what might have happened to me and the child I was in charge of, had I not made the right decisions at the time. This happened about a year ago, when I, a 23-year-old female, was babysitting for a family I'd been working with for a couple of years. The single dad and his little boy, about 5, had just moved into a new house with Dad's new girlfriend. The new neighborhood was a little sketchy, but next to a decent park and playground and closer to his work. He had dinner plans with his girlfriend and asked me to watch his son. I was about to move cities for grad school, so we were both happy that I got to spend time with him once more before I left. As his son and I had really bonded, and I was going to miss working for them. After they headed out for the evening, his son, who I'll call Brian from now on, and I headed to the park for some fun. We took his foam sword and a Ninja Turtle mask, and we were going to have a great last day together. After about a half hour, this group of guys was kind of hovering near us, and a couple of them called out to me, asking if I had a boyfriend, asking for my number. I gave very short answers and tried to just move Brian and I along to another area, even as they kept yelling questions to me. I was feeling kinda weird about it, so I told Brian we should walk back to the house for snacks and an episode or two of his favorite show. We could see the house from the park, so it was a very short walk. We got back to the house and I fixed Brian some juice and a snack, and turned on his favorite show. Maybe 20 minutes in, I heard someone stomping up the front porch stairs, and then a woman banging on the door as hard as she possibly could, and screaming bloody murder.
Open the door. Please let me in. Help me.
Brian and I were both very startled. I ushered him into his room and asked him to play by himself for a few minutes, all the while this woman was raising hell. I ran back to the door and tried to ask her what was wrong. What happened? Are you hurt? But she wouldn't say anything except open the door and please help me. There was no glass in the door, and I couldn't see her, nor could she see me. I'm a pretty empathetic and trusting person, and up to this point I was really concerned about whoever was trying to hurt her, and possibly me and Brian. And my hand was hovering over the doorknob, and I got a really bad feeling that maybe she was the one who might hurt me and Brian. I cracked the blinds, looked into the front yard, and there was a car haphazardly parked in the front lawn, and 2 men standing by the 2 open front doors of the car. I felt cold all over, and knew something was wrong. I went back to the door and yelled, "Ma'am, I will call the police for you if you need help, but that is all I can do for you. I'm not opening this door. Do you want me to call the police?" There was a frighteningly long pause, and then she slammed against the door as hard as she could, and yelled,
Open the door, bitch!
I just stood there frozen until several long, agonizing seconds later. I heard her walk down the stairs and get in the car, and I got back to the window fast enough to see them peel out of the yard and drive away. At this point, I was pretty terrified, but assumed the worst was over. As stupid as it was, I didn't want to freak his dad out and make them come home early for nothing, and now that the strangers were gone, I didn't see much point in calling the police. I debated back and forth about it, and decided I should at least call his dad and see what he wanted me to do, if anything. Here's where everything really started to go badly. My phone was old, and a bit water damaged, and would sometimes shut off or suddenly go dead, even when showing up to 30% battery left. As I was trying to call his dad, my phone did exactly this. I decided it was probably fine. I almost hadn't called anyway, and they would be back in an hour or 2 max. I searched the house for a compatible charger but couldn't find one. I remembered that the dad had left his iPhone at home, as the screen had been completely smashed, and was unreadable and no longer took touch commands. However, I realized I could probably still hold down the home button and voice command Siri to call his girlfriend. Unfortunately, although Siri answered, it wouldn't complete the call. I decided I was overreacting, and went back to Brian's room to play with him until they got back. He seemed oblivious to what had happened, and we were soon playing hide and seek happily around the house, although I still felt pretty uneasy about the whole damn thing. At this point, when it was almost completely dark outside, there was suddenly very loud banging on the door again. I almost jumped out of my skin. I told Brian I needed him to go back to his room again, although he was more reluctant to do so this time, and it took a lot of convincing, as he could tell something was wrong. The banging continued as I approached the door, and I yelled, "Who are you? What do you want?" There was just silence, which was scarier than what happened the first time. Then they started banging again, and stayed silent as I kept asking them what they wanted, when I realized this might just be a distraction. Horrified, I ran to the back door, somewhat noisily, and heard someone running away on the concrete patio behind the house. The door was thankfully locked. I checked them all before, but I was still scared out of my mind. I ran back to the front door, and the banging had stopped. I thought about how there might be a charger in my car in the driveway just outside, and if I was sure they were gone, maybe I could run out and try to find it. I waited at the door for what seemed like forever, listening for any sound and didn't hear anything. I decided to try and sneak a look through the window. I cracked the blinds and looked sideways to try and get a glimpse towards the door, and just on the other side of the door, pressed up against the house, clearly trying not to be seen, I could see a sliver of the back of someone's head, hair, and back. I didn't think my body could possibly be on any higher alert. But as cliche as it sounds, when I saw that, my blood really did feel like it turned to ice. I closed the blinds and thought for a few seconds and yelled, "Get the fuck off this porch! I'm calling the cops!" And waited. After a few seconds, I heard someone slowly walk across the porch, down the steps, and away. I ran back to the dad's broken phone and tried to get Siri to call 911, but no luck. I was almost in tears, but I knew I needed to make a plan and keep Brian calm while I waited for his parents to come back. I triple-checked all the doors and windows again, and went back to Brian's room. I was of course afraid of what might happen to me, but I was more afraid that whoever these people were, they were connected to the people at the park earlier, and knew that a little blonde-haired, blue-eyed boy was here alone, except for me, an unintimidating 5-foot-tall girl. I was afraid of what they might do to me, but more afraid that I wasn't even their main target. I had thought at first that maybe the woman in distress was a scam to rob the house. But why would they return knowing there were people here? Now I was convinced they were here for him, and possibly me too. I got Brian's shoes and a jacket on, as well as mine. I decided that if they came back, we were going to hole up in his room, and if they managed to break into either door, I was going to try to sneak out of his bedroom window, carrying him, and run to a neighbor's house. I was so scared that I wasn't going to be able to protect him. I had never really wished I was bigger or stronger to be able to protect myself. But now that I needed to protect Brian, I was wishing just that. I knew if I couldn't fight them off, or get Brian away fast enough, I was not going to be able to live with myself, even if I made it out. In the meantime, I sat Brian in front of the TV to distract him while I did 2-minute patrols at every door and window, waiting for any sign that they had returned, or that they might even still be here. An hour went by and still nothing, but by this point, his dad was supposed to be home. The dad was often a little late getting back, and I usually didn't mind as he always threw in a little extra when that happened. However, this was the worst possible situation for them not to be home on time. I kept waiting for them to get back as a minute turned into 15, turned into 30, turned into 45. It was approaching an hour when I heard footsteps coming up the porch. I thought I recognized the dad's voice, but was still scared to open the door after everything that had happened. I stood waiting at the door as he put his key in and he and his girlfriend opened it and walked in. I never felt so relieved in my life, and it must have shown on my face, because they took one look at me and got scared and asked what was wrong. I told them what had happened and apologized, over and over, that I couldn't get a hold of them or the police. I had been so scared that it was going to get worse before they got home. I wrote down everything that had happened for them, so that they could file a police report if they wanted to. Especially having just moved there, I was afraid they might stay a target for whoever was lurking around this neighborhood. I didn't know if they were just the creeps from the park trying to scare or hurt us, people wanting to kidnap Brian, or human traffickers who saw us at the park and wanted one or both of us. His dad was of course grateful that I'd done everything I could, and was glad I was okay, and was sorry I had to go through all of that. I just couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if the strangers had managed to get in, and I couldn't get Brian away, or if I'd been stupid enough to open the door initially. It was a scary lesson about people who prey on the empathy and vulnerability of others, and I was so glad I didn't make the wrong decisions when there was a life on the line, besides my own.
Number 4.
This story happened about 2 years ago, while I was in university working on my degree in biology. I had signed up for a trip to gather samples for an experiment some students in the ecology department were going to run. It required the collection of samples from several sites, so they recruited biology, ecology, and forestry majors to help them complete the sampling in a shorter period. The area my group was to take samples from was a few hours from my university in the Pacific Northwest. There were 9 of us in my group, 8 students and a supervising professor. We got to the campsite in the late evening and set up our tents. One of the other students had brought a big container of split pea soup from home and was sharing it with the others on the trip. I don't really care for split pea soup, so I declined the offer. Everyone had some except me, one other student, and the professor. Come the next morning, the 5 students who had eaten the soup weren't in the best of shape. They were in the grips of some gnarly food poisoning, and were in no shape to hike for 8 or 9 hours to collect the samples we needed. The professor who was supervising us had originally some rules, such as people travel in groups of at least 2, and we had to return to camp by nightfall. Now those rules were tossed out to make sure we kept to our timetable, and collected all of the required samples. We were just told to do your best to complete the work assigned as long as you can do it safely. That morning I set out for a long day of hiking. After a mile or so I ran into the stream I was supposed to follow. I needed to travel about 4 miles upstream, stopping every quarter mile to collect samples of the water and soil. This meant I had to hustle to get back before dark. Halfway through the day I realized that wasn't going to happen. About 2 miles into my hike, I stopped for lunch sitting on a log overlooking the stream. The scene was really peaceful until I smelled the cigarettes. It wasn't the smell of a cigarette being smoked, more the musty smell of a heavy smoker's car, where cigarette butts have been left to ferment for weeks on end. I looked around but couldn't see anyone. I just assumed that the wind had blown the scent of some hunter or hiker over to me, but minutes later the smell hadn't faded. The vegetation in the area wasn't that thick, but there was still a lot of places for someone to duck behind a tree or a bush. I was unnerved that someone was apparently staying close enough for me to smell them for this long without so much as a word. I quickly packed up the trash and my lunch and continued up the stream. The musty cigarette smell went away for the next few hours. It wasn't until I arrived at my last sample location late into dusk that I smelled it again. The woods were getting really dim by this point. Looking back on it, it was a really stupid idea to stay out so late, as just hiking back to camp in the dark would be pretty dangerous even without a cigarette-smoking stalker. Having just the collection tubes in my bag, I shined my flashlight around in the darkening woods looking for whoever was giving off the smell. I didn't see anything that caught my attention. It would actually be more correct to say I saw too many things in the dim light that might have been a head sticking out from behind a tree or someone crouched low in the foliage. I didn't like the idea of being in the dark woods with a stranger who, for the second time, was lurking near me without revealing themselves, so I began to double time it back down the stream. I made much better time on my way back, even though it was dark, because I didn't have to stop to take any samples. Even so, I didn't get back to camp until a bit before 10. I was the last one to get back and everyone but the professor was already asleep. I didn't mention the cigarette smell to the professor, because he seemed tired as it was, and he headed to his bed in the RV soon after I got back. I headed to my tent soon after. At some point of the night, I woke up needing to pee. I decided to head into the woods to do my business, as I knew some of the other students were still feeling ill, and needed the RV toilet for more urgent matters than just having to take a leak. I walked about 100 feet into the woods, found a tree, and did what I needed to. As I turned to go back to camp, something caught my eye. Somewhere off in the woods, there was a tiny red glow. I was confused as to what it was, until it flared momentarily, and I realized it was the cherry of a cigarette. I stood there for a while, watching the red amber glow. Not being able to see the person, I assumed they were watching the camp. I didn't know if they had seen me make my way into the woods or not, as the fire had been doused, and the moon was only half full, so there wasn't very much light. I made my way slowly back to camp as quietly as I could, and entered the RV to wake up the professor. I told him about the person smoking in the woods, and about the smell of cigarettes earlier that day. However, when we got outside the RV, the ember from the cigarette was gone. My professor woke the other student who hadn't come down with food poisoning, and we took turns watching over camp. I didn't see or smell anything else when I was on guard duty, and went to sleep when the professor woke up for his turn. In the morning, the professor, the other student, and I went to where I guessed the smoker had been standing the night before, and sure enough we found about 10 cigarette butts on the ground next to a tree. The tree itself looked like someone had been twisting and stabbing a knife or other sharp object into it, as the bark and outer layers of wood had been damaged and chipped away. The professor decided that the group should head back that day, even though we hadn't collected all the samples we were assigned, to be on the safe side. We packed up camp and drove down the thin dirt trail without incident. The second we got onto the paved highway, though, a white paneled van pulled out of a clearing just off the shoulder and began following us. This van stayed behind us all the way back, pulling off the highway when we did, taking the same surface streets that we did, and only stopped following us when we turned onto the road leading to our university campus. Everyone was freaked out by this, but it was around 9 at night on a weekend, so the security office on campus was closed. We decided to unload the RV and call it a night, as the van hadn't followed us onto campus. I offered to help the professor catalog and store the collection tubes from our trip. So it was another couple of hours before I left the biological sciences building and started heading toward the dorm building I lived in. I stepped out into the cool night air and began walking, my professor having left the building in the other direction to get to his car and drive home. It was a couple dozen feet outside of the building, which was now locked, when I was hit with the musty smell of old cigarettes. I looked around, and about 25 yards away in the darkness off of the footpath, I saw the cherry of a cigarette smoldering away. I was pretty scared at this point, but hoped it was only a student or some faculty staying late having a smoke. I couldn't completely convince myself of this, though, as the musty cigarette smell was the same as what I smelled in the woods the previous night. I started down the footpath and soon passed whoever was smoking. 100 feet or so later, I looked over my shoulder and saw the cigarette cherry bobbing in the darkness. The smoker was following me. This creeped me out a bit more, but I still held it together. That is, until I rounded a small stand of trees and saw a white paneled van parked alone in a parking lot. I took off at a sprint toward my dorm building. I looked over my shoulder a few steps into my run. I saw the cherry of the cigarette fall to the ground, and a dark shape beginning to move after me. I didn't look back again, but I could hear someone running in the grass off of the footpath. I got to the entrance to my dorm building, and frantically waved my key card in front of the card reader that controlled the door lock. As soon as I heard the soft beep, I opened the door, jumped through the doorway, and shut the door quickly. I stopped and peered through the glass door. I saw the dark shape stop just short of the lit pathway. I just watched for a minute or two. Then I saw the spark of a lighter. The light is just barely bright enough to illuminate a shaggy beard and the brim of a baseball cap, before it disappears and was replaced with the red glow of a cigarette. I turned and headed up the stairs to my dorm room. By the time I get to my window overlooking the same yard I just run through, there was no trace of a dark figure or a cigarette cherry. After that, I didn't see that white paneled van again, or smell that musty cigarette smell, and I hope I never do. Hey there, everybody. Hollowkeez here. Do you recall the story? I believe it was number 2, with the homeless man on the bus. To many of you, it probably wasn't scary, or creepy at all. It was okay, but I need to read a bit more of the story before recording, I think. I will say, though, that I kept laughing while recording the part where he was drumming with the bottle of Febreze. That marks the first time I've ever messed up because I couldn't contain laughter. That part was simply ridiculous to imagine. Anyway, it's been some time since my last video. I decided I would take a little break as the 10 stories of demonic possession took so long to make. But then, when I was going to get started with this video, something reared its ugly head. It was an issue I really had to take care of before I made any more videos. So yeah, sorry about the wait. Before I end this video, quick question. Do you guys think I should give my own personal creepy stories at the end of my videos? I'm thinking about it, though I have more paranormal stories to tell compared to creepy people. Anyway, give your opinion in the comment section below. And remember, I am taking story submissions, so send them in if you have any. My email address will be in the description, and you also get a shout out. If it's fear you're after, welcome home.